I am Sienna, 34 years old, and holding my 3-month-old son Leo in an apartment so cold I could see my own breath. Until a freezing Tuesday morning, I had no idea my own mother and sister had orchestrated a financial betrayal so deep it almost cost my son his life. My husband Julian passed away from cancer a year ago, leaving me to navigate single motherhood and my freelance recipe development business entirely alone. Or so I thought. When the truth finally spilled out, I didn't just walk away and cry. I dismantled their entire fake empire dollar by dollar. Before I tell you how a single visit from my grandmother triggered a multi-million-dollar war, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Please like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family. Growing up in Atlanta's affluent circles, my family operated on a strict currency of appearances and social standing. My mother Valerie lived for country club galas and Sunday service photo ops. My younger sister Jasmine was the undisputed golden child, a status she cemented by marrying Preston, a loud, arrogant white investment banker who paraded around as our family's financial savior. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. I was the independent daughter who chose culinary arts over corporate law and married a kind-hearted architect instead of a billionaire. That morning, the radiator in my tiny, run-down apartment had broken again. I was wrapped in 3 layers of thrift store sweaters, rocking a crying Leo against my chest, praying the space heater would kick in. Then a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the thin wooden door. When I opened it, I froze. Standing in the hallway, swathed in a pristine camel hair coat and clutching a designer leather handbag, was my grandmother, Odessa. At 78 years old, she was the formidable matriarch of our family and the founder of a massive multi-million-dollar hair care empire. She had spent the last 14 months at a private medical retreat in Switzerland, recovering from a severe stroke entirely cut off from the family's day-to-day drama. "Grandma!" I gasped instinctively, pulling the door wider. "You're back. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Odessa stepped into the cramped, dimly lit living room. She did not reach out to hug me. Instead, her sharp, calculating eyes swept over the peeling wallpaper, the tiny electric heater, and the faded, worn-out blankets swaddling my newborn son. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disappointment. "Sienna," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet octave. "What is the meaning of this? Is this some sort of sick, dramatic performance for sympathy?" "Performance?" I stepped back, clutching Leo tighter. "Grandma, the heater broke last night. I'm just trying to keep him warm until the landlord fixes it." Odessa's jaw clenched. She pointed a manicured finger at my frayed sweater. "You are living in a slum. You look like a beggar on the street. When your mother told me you were being irresponsible, I refused to believe it. But seeing you holding my great-grandson in this freezing, filthy box is absolutely disgraceful. Wasn't $200,000 a month enough for you?" The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. I stared at her, my mind scrambling to process the words she had just spoken. "What did you just say?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do not play dumb with me, Sienna," Odessa snapped, her authoritative tone echoing off the thin walls. "The day Julian passed away, I instructed my wealth management team to set up an irrevocable trust fund for you and the baby, $200,000 wired on the first of every single month to guarantee you would never have to struggle. I wanted you to buy a house in Buckhead, to hire a nanny to grieve in peace. And instead, I find you living like a vagrant. What did you do with the money? Did you give it to some scammer? Did you gamble it away?" My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I walked over to the small kitchen counter, grabbed my phone with shaking fingers, and opened my banking app. I thrust the glowing screen directly into her line of sight. "Look at it!" I demanded, my voice cracking with rising panic and rage. "Look at my account, Grandma. I have exactly $42.16 to my name. I have a stack of hospital bills from Julian's treatments that are in collections. I am working 3 freelance jobs just to afford Leo's formula. I never received a single dollar from you. Not one." Odessa stared at the screen. The anger in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying realization. The matriarch of our family had not built a business empire by being naive. She immediately understood that a massive calculated crime had taken place right under her nose. "Who handled Julian's estate paperwork when I was in Switzerland?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. "Preston," I answered, the sickening truth dawning on me. Mom insisted that Preston take over my financial transition. She said I was too emotional to handle the legal documents, and since Preston was a finance expert, he would set up my widow accounts for free. Odessa did not cry. She did not gasp or offer empty condolences. She reached into her camel hair coat, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. "Marcus," she barked into the receiver, speaking to her lead financial attorney. "I want an emergency freeze on the family's primary trust accounts. Right now. Someone has forged my signature and diverted the widow's fund I established last year." She put the phone on speaker and placed it on the counter. The heavy, suffocating silence in the freezing room was absolutely deafening. We both silently stared at the glowing cell phone screen for 10 agonizing minutes until the lawyer finally called her back with the devastating truth. I did not wait for the landlord. I strapped Leo into his seat and followed my grandmother to the waiting car. The drive to the Georgian Terrace Hotel was a blur of city lights and suffocating silence. Odessa sat rigidly upright next to me, her manicured fingers tapping a calculated rhythm against her designer handbag. I looked down at my frayed wool sweater and the faded baby blanket wrapping Leo. I felt entirely out of place, but the burning anger in my chest eclipsed my usual shame. For a year, I had internalized my family's narrative that I was simply a failure who could not manage her grief or her finances. Now I knew the agonizing truth. I was not a failure. I was a victim of a meticulously calculated robbery. When the hired driver pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet rushed forward. The crisp night air hit my face, carrying the faint sound of a classical string quartet playing from the ballroom above. "Keep your head up, Sienna," Odessa ordered as we stepped onto the velvet carpet. "Thieves operate best in the shadows. We are going to drag them into the blinding light." I adjusted Leo securely against my chest and walked through the ornate double doors. The breathtaking crystal ballroom was a sea of champagne flutes, dripping gold chandeliers, and Atlanta's most elite socialites, all flawlessly dressed in custom evening gowns and sharply tailored tuxedos. The stark contrast between their diamond-studded elegance and my thrift store layers was immediate and jarring. As I stepped fully into the light, the conversations nearest to the entrance abruptly halted. Whispers erupted like a sudden gust of wind moving through a dry forest. Heads turned, eyes widened in blatant shock. I was a walking scandal, a living, breathing stain on the pristine aesthetic of the evening. It took less than 30 seconds for my mother to notice the disruption. Valerie was standing near the grand ice sculpture in the center of the room, holding a crystal flute and laughing at something a local politician had just said. When her eyes landed on me, the polite, practiced smile vanished from her face. A wave of absolute undeniable panic and sheer fury instantly replaced it. She excused herself hastily and marched toward me, the heavy silk of her emerald gown snapping with every furious step. Before I could even say a word, she grabbed my upper arm with bruising force and yanked me behind a massive floral arrangement near the coat check. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Valerie hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage so the nearby guests would not hear. "What are you doing here looking like absolute trash? This is the most important charity luncheon of the season. You are deliberately trying to humiliate me in front of the entire women's society." Mom let go of my arm. I said, my voice eerily calm despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "I am not here to ruin your party. I am here because we need to talk about Preston." Valerie let out a sharp, mocking scoff. "Do not you dare bring Preston into your pathetic drama. Your sister and her husband just secured their place as the guests of honor tonight. They just wrote a $50,000 check to the Children's Hospital Fund. $50,000, Sienna. While you cannot even afford a proper coat for your own child. You are jealous and you are bitter, and I will not let you ruin Jasmine's night. Get out of here right now before I call security and have you physically thrown onto the sidewalk." Before I could respond, a sickeningly familiar voice floated over from the hallway. "Valerie, is everything all right over here? We noticed a bit of a commotion." Preston casually strolled around the edge of the floral arrangement, comfortably holding a half-empty glass of incredibly expensive scotch. Jasmine was clinging tightly to his other arm, dripping in diamonds that caught the chandelier light. When Preston saw me, a cruel, arrogant smirk spread across his perfectly tanned face. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my frayed sleeves and Leo's faded blanket. "Well, if it isn't the family charity case," Preston sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I thought you were busy scraping together pennies for your heating bill, Sienna. Did you get lost on the way to the soup kitchen?" Jasmine let out a high melodic laugh, covering her mouth delicately. "Preston, do not be mean. She is probably just hungry. You know how she struggles to feed the baby since she refuses to get a real corporate job." My grip on Leo tightened. The sheer audacity of their performance was nauseating. They were standing there radiating wealth and superiority, wearing the exact money they had stolen from my starving child. "I am not here for the food, Preston," I stated, staring directly into his mocking blue eyes. "I am here to ask you about the estate paperwork you handled for Julian." Preston's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a microscopic twitch of panic that I would have missed if I had not been looking for it. But he quickly recovered, puffing out his chest and reaching into his tailored suit jacket. "Listen, Sienna," Preston said, pulling out his designer leather wallet. "I know times are tough for you. It is sad, really, but you cannot just crash private elite events begging for handouts. It makes Valerie look terrible." He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and held it out toward me, waving it lazily in the air. "Here, take this. Go buy food and catch a taxi back to whatever slum you are living in. Let the adults enjoy their evening." I did not take the money. I did not even blink. I just watched the disgusting display of his fake charity. Before Preston could retract his hand, the heavy, unmistakable sound of a silver-tipped walking cane struck the marble floor behind me. Odessa stepped out from the shadows of the coat-check corridor. The entire temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Valerie gasped, stumbling backward and nearly dropping her champagne glass. Jasmine let out a strangled squeak, her manicured hand flying to her throat. Preston stood completely frozen, the $100 bill still hovering uselessly in the air. Odessa did not say hello. She did not ask how their evening was going. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a thick, heavily stamped stack of certified bank records, and threw them violently. The heavy papers smacked directly into Preston's chest, scattering across the polished marble floor at his expensive Italian leather shoes. "You can keep your $100, you parasitic fraud," Odessa commanded, her voice slicing through the air like a razor blade. "I am here to collect the $1.2 million you stole from my great-grandson." The absolute silence that followed Odessa's declaration was deafening. Every single guest in the crystal ballroom stopped breathing. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, leaving the clinking of a dropped fork to echo across the marble floor like a gunshot. Preston's fake tan seemed to pale into a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the certified bank records scattered around his expensive Italian leather shoes, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. Jasmine looked from her husband to my grandmother, her diamond-draped arms dropping to her sides as genuine confusion warped her perfectly contoured face. For a glorious, terrifying second, I thought the white savior of our family was finally going to confess. But I had severely underestimated my mother's desperate addiction to high society status. Instead of showing even a fraction of remorse or shock, Valerie lunged forward. She physically positioned her body between her towering, arrogant son-in-law and her frail but terrifyingly furious mother. She kicked the bank records aside with her emerald silk gown, her eyes flashing with a toxic, manic desperation. "Mother, you need to lower your voice immediately," Valerie hissed, glancing frantically at the staring socialites and wealthy donors surrounding us. "You are making a complete fool of yourself. Preston did not steal anything from anyone. I authorized that transfer." My grandmother leaned heavily on her silver-tipped walking cane, her sharp eyes boring into Valerie's soul. "You authorized the transfer of the widow's fund, the money I specifically set aside for Sienna and her infant son. You bypassed the legal parameters of my trust to hand my money to this glorified con artist." I protected our family assets, Valerie shouted, her voice echoing loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. I did what I had to do because Sienna is a liar and a manipulator. She is trying to con this entire family out of millions of dollars. I felt a cold, sickening knot twist violently in my stomach. Mom, what are you talking about? I demanded, stepping forward and shielding Leo instinctively. What lie? Julian died of cancer. We were left with nothing. How am I conning anyone? Valerie turned her venomous glare entirely onto me. The maternal mask was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, image-obsessed monster, willing to destroy her own flesh and blood to save a charity gala. She took a deep breath, ensuring her voice would carry to the back of the room. You want to play the tragic grieving widow in front of all my friends? Sienna, fine. Let us tell everyone the real truth. Valerie announced, her tone dripping with absolute malice. Julian was sterile. The chemotherapy treatments absolutely destroyed his reproductive system long before that child was ever conceived. The doctors told you both that he would never ever be able to father a child. A loud collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Jasmine's eyes widened and she covered her mouth, a cruel smile beginning to form behind her manicured fingers. That is a lie! I shouted, my voice shaking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. How dare you speak about Julian that way? You have no right to discuss his medical history. I have every right to protect my mother's empire from a fraud, Valerie retorted, stepping closer to me, pointing a sharp acrylic nail directly at my newborn son. That baby is illegitimate. He is not Julian's son. He has no biological ties to this family whatsoever. You slept with some random stranger, got pregnant, and now you are trying to pass off a bastard child as the rightful heir to the $200,000 monthly trust fund. That is exactly why I had Preston intercept the money. I was securing our legacy from a cheating, greedy opportunist. The sheer cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. The room began to spin. She was publicly erasing my husband's legacy, branding my innocent baby as a tool for a financial scam, all to protect a thief. My mother had just declared me an adulteress and a criminal in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. I looked at Odessa, terrified that the seed of doubt had been planted in her mind. But my grandmother did not look at Leo with suspicion. She looked at Valerie with pure, unadulterated disgust. Before Odessa could strike back, Preston regained his footing. The momentary panic he had displayed seconds ago was completely replaced by his usual smug arrogance. With Valerie publicly validating his theft under the guise of family protection, he suddenly felt untouchable again. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket, stepping out from behind my mother with a predatory grin. You heard your mother, Sienna? Preston said, his voice loud, confident and dripping with condescension. The jig is up. We all know you are broke, living in a freezing slum and trying to pull off a massive financial scam. It is pathetic, honestly. But since you brought this dirty laundry into a public forum, I think we need to address the real issue here. Preston pulled his smartphone from his pocket, tapping the screen with deliberate, exaggerated slowness. What are you doing, Preston? I demanded, stepping backward as my protective instincts flared. I am calling Child Protective Services, Preston announced, holding the phone up for the crowd to see. You just admitted you are living in a freezing apartment without heat. You are parading an infant around a charity gala in filthy rags late at night. You are clearly suffering from an unstable mental state, making up wild delusions about stolen money to cover up your infidelity. A child is not safe in your custody, Sienna. As an upstanding, wealthy member of this community, I have a moral obligation to report you. They are going to take that baby away tonight, and you are going to leave this hotel in the back of a police cruiser. I will make absolutely certain that you never see him again. Preston's threat hung in the air, a vile promise designed to break me. He held his smartphone like a weapon, expecting me to drop to my knees and beg. My mother Valerie stood beside him, her chin raised in maternal righteousness. She genuinely believed the threat of losing my son would force me to retreat into the shadows, taking the theft of my trust fund with me. Instead of screaming or crying, I felt an eerie, absolute calm wash over my body, the terrified, grieving widow. they had walked all over for 12 months, was dead. I looked at my brother-in-law and the ruthless mother who had publicly branded my child a bastard. I reached deep into my tote bag, bypassed the baby wipes, and pulled out my tablet. I did not need to yell over the gasps of the society crowd. I just needed the wireless network. During college, I had worked part-time doing audiovisual setups for corporate events at this hotel. I intimately knew the master override code for the ballroom's presentation screens. Within seconds, my tablet synced to the massive digital projectors flanking the main stage, which were currently displaying the charity's logo. "Call them Preston," I challenged, my voice cutting through the thick tension with lethal precision. "Call Child Protective Services, call the police. But while we stand here and wait for them to arrive, I think the Women's Society deserves to see the rest of the family legacy you are so desperate to protect." I tapped my screen. The charity logos vanished, replaced instantly by certified medical documents from the Emory Winship Cancer Institute. The black font was massive, impossible for anyone in the room to miss. "My husband Julian was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma," I announced, projecting my voice across the silent ballroom. "And yes, Valerie, you are absolutely correct that the aggressive chemotherapy treatments rendered him completely sterile. But what you conveniently left out of your vicious, slanderous story is that we prepared for it." I swiped my finger to the next document. "These are the official cryogenic preservation records. Julian froze his sperm 6 months before his medical treatments began. And this," I tapped the screen once again, bringing up a certified DNA paternity test alongside the fertility clinic's embryo transfer logs, "is the undeniable legal proof that Leo is 100% Julian's biological son. He is the rightful heir to the widow's fund you helped Preston steal." The crowd erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Valerie's face turned the color of chalk. She stumbled backward in her emerald dress, bumping heavily into the melting ice sculpture. Jasmine stared at the screens, her jaw unhinged, suddenly realizing the magnitude of the lie she had backed. Preston lowered his phone, the threat of calling the authorities completely dissolving in the face of irrefutable digital evidence. But I was not finished. "You wanted to talk about protecting the family assets, Preston," I continued, stepping closer to his frozen form. "Let us talk about why you intercepted my money. Let us talk about what happened 3 days before Julian died." I tapped the screen one final time. A stark black audio file interface appeared. I hit play. The audio was crystal clear, recovered directly from the hidden dashcam in Julian's car, recorded while it was parked in the lonely hospital garage. Preston's voice, frantic and aggressive, echoed loudly through the ballroom's surround sound system. "Julian, you have to co-sign this bridge loan," the recorded Preston begged, his elite facade entirely absent. "My real estate firm is drowning. I am leveraged to the absolute limit. If Valerie finds out I am completely broke, she will force Jasmine to divorce me. Just sign the damn paper. You are dying anyway, man. You do not need the credit score." Then Julian's weak but resolute voice answered, "I am not bankrupting my wife and future child to pay off your gambling debts, Preston. Get out of my car." The audio clipped off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The white savior of our family was publicly exposed, not just as a common thief, but as a desperate predatory fraud who had mercilessly tormented a dying man. The wealthy donors began physically backing away from Preston and Jasmine as if they were contagious. Jasmine looked at her husband with sheer horror, finally grasping that the lavish lifestyle she had been flaunting was built on a crumbling foundation of debt and stolen money. Valerie gripped her chest, hyperventilating as her precious, carefully curated social standing disintegrated before her very eyes. Odessa, who had stood silently absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, suddenly swayed. The iron-willed matriarch raised a shaking hand to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The horrific shock of realizing her own daughter had colluded with a degenerate fraud to terrorize a dying man and rob her great-grandson was simply too much for her recovering heart. "Grandma!" I screamed, lunging forward as Odessa collapsed onto the hard, polished marble floor. The ballroom erupted into pure chaos. Panicked guests shouted for an ambulance. I dropped to my knees, holding Leo securely in one arm, while desperately cradling Odessa's gray head with my free hand. Paramedics stormed into the elegant room within minutes, pushing me aside to rapidly administer emergency oxygen and carefully load her frail body onto a mobile stretcher. As I scrambled to my feet, desperate to follow them out to the waiting ambulance, Preston stepped deliberately into my path. His blue eyes were wild-cornered and entirely ruthless. He pulled his smartphone up his thumb, dialing a new number. "You think you won, Sienna?" He sneered viciously, blocking my way as the paramedics urgently rolled Odessa out the double doors. "She just had another massive stroke. She is incapacitated. I am calling the judge right now to file for emergency conservatorship over Odessa and her entire estate. You are locked out and I am taking everything." Preston was not making an empty threat. He stood confidently in the middle of the glittering ballroom, entirely ignoring the chaotic murmur of the wealthy socialites, and dialed a corrupt district judge he played golf with every single Sunday. I did not stay to listen to his desperate legal maneuvering. I sprinted out the grand double doors into the freezing night air, clutching Leo tightly to my chest, and hailed the first taxi I could find to follow my grandmother's ambulance directly to the hospital. By the time I arrived at the emergency wing, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated a terrible reality I was not prepared for. Two heavily armed private security guards were already stationed outside the intensive care unit. Preston had moved with terrifying speed, utilizing his forged documents and his elite connections. He had filed an emergency injunction granting him temporary medical and financial conservatorship over Odessa, falsely claiming my mother Valerie as the primary co-signer. When I tried to approach the glass doors to see my grandmother, a burly guard placed a massive hand flat against my chest, violently shoving me backward. I was legally barred from entering the room. I was not allowed to speak to her doctors. I was completely locked out. Over the next 48 agonizing hours, my treacherous mother and sister moved with a sickening level of ruthless efficiency to solidify their stolen power. With Odessa lying heavily monitored in a medically induced coma, Valerie and Jasmine joyfully seized total control of the family properties and the massive haircare empire. Jasmine immediately began posting obnoxious photos on social media from inside my grandmother's sprawling Buckhead estate, shamelessly flaunting her new status as the acting matriarch of the family. They maliciously canceled my security clearance at the corporate headquarters. They legally trespassed me from every single building my family owned across the city. They fully intended to freeze me out entirely, hoping the cold, crushing weight of severe poverty would quickly force me to pack up my baby and disappear from Atlanta forever. They thought I was just a helpless, destitute widow who had suddenly lost her only powerful ally. They genuinely believed that I would just quietly accept my tragic defeat and crawl back into the miserable shadows. They were incredibly wrong. On the third miserable morning of my bitter exile, a sharp, urgent knock rattled my apartment door. I cautiously opened it to find Marcus, my grandmother's lead financial attorney, standing nervously in the cramped, poorly lit hallway. He looked thoroughly exhausted, his silk tie loosened, and a thick briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. He stepped inside, quickly casting a grim, pitiful look at my broken radiator before pulling a single vital sheet of paper from his leather bag. He heavily explained that Preston had successfully frozen the primary family trusts, immediately cutting off all access to Odessa's corporate wealth. However, Marcus was certainly not a novice. The moment I had shown Odessa my empty bank account in this very room, she had brilliantly given him a secondary covert directive. Right before she tragically collapsed at the charity gala, Marcus had successfully executed a highly secure digital override on a hidden contingency account. He handed me the printed confirmation receipt with a solemn nod. A single untraceable emergency wire transfer of exactly $200,000 had successfully cleared into my private checking account just minutes before Preston's crooked judge locked the entire estate down. I silently stared at the staggering number printed boldly on the crisp receipt. $200,000 in liquid cash. It was more than enough money to immediately pay off all of Julian's outstanding medical debts. It was enough to move Leo out of this freezing, dangerous slum and into a beautiful, warm home in the peaceful suburbs. It was enough to buy fresh groceries, pay for premium childcare, and comfortably restart my culinary business without ever having to speak to my highly toxic family again. I held the paper in my trembling hands, feeling the overwhelming, intoxicating temptation of true safety wash over my tired body. But then I looked closely at the dark circles under my eyes in the cracked hallway mirror. I thought about the cruel, arrogant smirk on Preston's face when he maliciously threw $100 bill at me. I thought about my own mother publicly declaring my innocent son a bastard just to protect a blatant thief. Comfort and safety were simply no longer enough. I did not just want to peacefully survive anymore. I deeply wanted absolute, unmitigated justice. I wanted to see them utterly fall. I looked Marcus directly in his eyes and asked him exactly who the most ruthless, aggressive forensic accounting firm in the entire state of Georgia was. He raised a knowing eyebrow, understanding exactly what I was meticulously planning, and handed me a glossy business card for a boutique agency famous for destroying massive corporate empires. I did not pay my overdue rent. I did not turn the heat on. Instead, I took a massive, terrifying gamble. I opened my banking app, entered the routing number for the elite investigative firm, and immediately wired the entire $200,000 as an upfront retainer. I hired a team of relentless financial predators, specifically instructing them to viciously tear apart every single shred of Preston's background, his shady shell companies, and his fake personal life. They had my unlimited authorization to ruthlessly dig through his trash, deeply hack his public filings, and carefully trace every single stolen dollar he had ever moved. I confidently bet my entire future on the firm belief that a man as utterly arrogant and desperate as Preston had left a wide trail of sloppy, catastrophic mistakes. I was going to uncover his darkest, most closely guarded secrets, and I was going to strategically use them to completely destroy him. There was absolutely no turning back now. The absolute countdown to his spectacular ultimate ruin had finally officially begun. The forensic accounting firm did not waste a single second. Within exactly 2 entire days of receiving my massive wire transfer, the lead investigator, a ruthless former federal agent named David, requested a highly secure video conference. I sat at my small, scratched kitchen table, nervously watching Leo sleep peacefully in his bassinet, as David finally shared his screen with me. The sheer volume of digital files, hidden bank statements, and intercepted offshore communications was absolutely staggering to witness. Preston had spent the last 5 years meticulously crafting an impenetrable illusion of immense wealth, but beneath the glossy surface, his entire life was a remarkably fragile house of cards. David began by completely obliterating his carefully curated origin story. He did not come from a prestigious lineage of old Boston money. He grew up in a very standard middle-class suburb in Ohio, legally changing his name to sound significantly more elite after barely graduating from a mediocre business college. His supposedly massive real estate firm, Apex Development Partners, was nothing but a spectacular mirage. Preston did not own any of the commercial properties he constantly bragged about at my mother's charity events. The firm was just a hollow shell company formally registered to a vacant, abandoned strip mall located on the outskirts of the city. He generated his income by acting as a glorified middleman, securing predatory bridge loans for desperate developers and taking a massive, highly illegal cut of the initial financing. But his severe gambling addiction had entirely consumed all of his financial profits. David precisely tracked the stolen $1.2 million from my widow's fund directly through a complex labyrinth of anonymous shell accounts. Not a single cent went into family investments. Preston had desperately used my money to pacify a violent, underground sports betting syndicate that had been actively threatening his life for several terrifying months. The forensic team then tore apart the lavish lifestyle my mother and sister were so incredibly proud of. The fleet of luxury European sports cars parked in his driveway were all heavily leveraged leases dangerously close to repossession. The sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, where Jasmine currently paraded around as the reigning queen of Atlanta society, was not purchased with cash. Preston had taken out 3 separate, incredibly high-interest mortgages against the property, effectively draining all its equity. He was using the stolen funds from my grandmother's estate to barely cover the minimum monthly interest payments, desperately keeping the illusion alive, just long enough for his ultimate exit strategy. Valerie and Jasmine were unknowingly sitting on a ticking financial time bomb that was guaranteed to destroy them. But the most sickening revelation was his exit strategy. David pulled up a series of encrypted emails and offshore banking alerts that made my blood run cold. Preston was never planning to stay in Atlanta, and he certainly was not planning to stay married to my sister. He had covertly opened an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. He was systematically draining whatever liquid assets remained in the family trusts that Valerie had so eagerly handed over to him. David highlighted a pair of first-class one-way plane tickets booked for exactly 14 days from today. Preston was fleeing the country. But the second ticket did not have Jasmine's name on it. Preston was planning to disappear with his secret mistress, a 24-year-old paralegal, who worked at the exact same law firm where he had bribed a corrupt judge to lock my grandmother away. He had already drafted brutal divorce papers that would legally blindside Jasmine the morning his flight took off. Because Valerie had foolishly and jointly signed multiple fraudulent investment portfolios to boost her own social standing, his sudden disappearance would legally leave my mother and my sister solely responsible for over $5 million in toxic, unpayable debt. They would lose their homes, their cars, and their absolute freedom. They would face federal prison for the financial crimes he had expertly framed them for. I stared at the glowing computer screen, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated evil of his grand plan. My mother had thrown me out into the freezing cold, deeply convinced she was securing her glamorous future while she was actually handing the keys to a ruthless predator. She had viciously slandered my dead husband and bastardized my innocent child to protect a man who was actively pushing her toward total annihilation. A small, weak part of me momentarily wondered if I should warn them. If I should call Jasmine and tell her to pack her bags before the inevitable explosion. But then I remembered the cruel melodic sound of her laughter when he threw a $100 bill at me. I remembered the cold, disgusted look on my mother's face. They had made their horrific bed and they were going to sleep in it. I thanked David for the explosive evidence and instructed him to prepare the final devastating legal trap. I needed to move with absolute flawless precision. I could not just hand this information over to the police. Preston would immediately leverage his corrupt judicial connections to stall the investigation and flee. I had to legally bind him, corner him, and completely strip him of his stolen power before he ever stepped foot on that airplane. My mind raced with strategic possibilities as I safely packed Leo into his old stroller. We needed baby formula, and I needed fresh air to clear my thoughts. I walked the 3 miles to a discount grocery store located on the edge of the affluent suburbs, keeping my head down against the biting winter wind. I was carefully calculating my next financial strike, meticulously planning exactly how to buy his debt anonymously, when a sharp, condescending voice shattered my intense focus. I very slowly looked right up from the dusty bargain aisle, coming face to face with the absolute last person I ever wanted to see. Jasmine stood at the end of the aisle looking like she had stepped off a runway and wandered into a disaster zone. She was draped in a pristine cashmere coat, balancing a designer handbag on her forearm. She pinched her nose, glaring at the scuffed linoleum floor as if it might infect her. What she was doing in a discount grocery store was a mystery, but the malicious delight in her eyes when she recognized me was unmistakable. She did not politely ignore me or walk away. She marched directly down the narrow aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the cheap flooring, stopping just inches from my battered shopping cart. "Well, this is just perfectly tragic," Jasmine sneered, her eyes scanning the few generic cans of soup and the budget brand baby formula sitting in my basket. "Mom told me you were scraping the bottom of the barrel, Sienna, but I honestly did not think it was this bad. Are you literally shopping for dented cans now?" I gripped the handle of the shopping cart, forcing my breathing to remain slow and even. The irony of her standing there draped in cashmere paid for by my stolen survival funds was almost too much to bear. I knew exactly what her husband was planning to do to her in 14 days. I knew about the secret paralegal and the offshore accounts. I could have completely destroyed her entire world right there in the canned goods aisle. But I needed her to keep talking. I needed to know exactly what their immediate plans were. I am just buying what I need, Jasmine, I replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral and devoid of any emotion. We cannot all rely on a wealthy husband to fund our grocery trips. Jasmine let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet store. She reached out and tapped a manicured fingernail against a plastic box of generic diapers. You really should have learned how to play the game, Sienna, she boasted, flipping her flawless hair over her shoulder. Preston is a financial genius. You thought you were so much better than us because you wanted to be an independent, struggling artist. Look where it got you. You are shivering in a discount store, and Preston is about to permanently cement our status as the absolute elite of Atlanta society. Is that right? I asked, feigning a pathetic, defeated tone to stroke her massive ego. What exactly is he doing now? Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with toxic pride. He is officially launching the Apex Tower next Friday night, she announced, practically vibrating with excitement. It is a massive luxury high-rise development in the heart of downtown. We are hosting the most exclusive launch party the city has ever seen. The mayor and governor are coming. We are going to be featured on the cover of every business magazine in the state. Preston is securing the final round of elite investor funding, and then we are virtually untouchable. I stared at her, my mind racing at breakneck speed. The launch party was next Friday. That was exactly 6 days away. Preston was not securing investor funding to build a high-rise. He was staging a massive fraudulent public spectacle to collect one final influx of stolen cash from Atlanta's elite before he fled to the Cayman Islands. He was using this party as his exit scam. That sounds like quite the event, I said quietly, gripping the cart tighter. I am sure Grandma Odessa will be thrilled to miss it while she is fighting for her life in a coma. Jasmine's smile did not falter. In fact, it grew wider, twisting into something genuinely sinister and cold. She casually inspected her diamond wedding ring, the very ring Preston bought with my dead husband's money, before looking back at me with dead eyes. Actually, Sienna, that is the other reason I am in such a fantastic mood today, Jasmine whispered, leaning in closer so other shoppers would not hear her vile confession. The doctors told us yesterday that Odessa has shown zero signs of brain activity. She is completely brain dead. Preston spoke with the hospital administration this morning. As her legal conservators, Mom and Preston made the very difficult medical decision to officially discontinue her life support. My blood turned to ice. The grocery store seemed to tilt dangerously. You are killing her, I gasped, horrified by the sheer depths of their depravity. We are letting her pass on peacefully, Jasmine corrected, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. It is what she would have wanted. But we are not monsters, Sienna. We are waiting until after Preston's launch party next Friday to pull the plug. We do not want a funeral depressing the mood of our big real estate debut. By next Saturday morning, Odessa will be gone. The final will get executed, and Mom and I inherit the entire hair care empire free and clear. And you get absolutely nothing. You are officially erased from this family. Jasmine gave me one final triumphant smirk, turned on her heel, and strutted out of the discount store, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in the stale air. I stood frozen in the aisle, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The timeline had just violently accelerated. Preston was not just planning to steal the money and run in 2 weeks. He and my mother were going to legally murder my grandmother in exactly 7 days to trigger the final inheritance payout before he vanished. I looked down at Leo, who was staring up at me with wide, innocent eyes. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed over me with the force of a freight train. I did not have 2 weeks to carefully build a legal case against my brother-in-law. I had exactly 6 days to completely dismantle Preston's fraudulent life, hijack his massive debt, and burn his fake empire to the ground before they killed my grandmother and fled the country forever. I sprinted out of the discount grocery store, gripping Leo's stroller. The biting winter wind whipped my face, but I barely felt the cold. Jasmine's cruel voice echoed in my mind, confirming the execution date for my grandmother and my family's legacy. 6 days. I had 144 hours to execute a financial takeover so aggressive it would leave Preston paralyzed. Locking my apartment door, I bypassed the broken radiator and dialed David's secure line. The former federal agent answered immediately, sensing the panic radiating through the phone. I relayed every word of Jasmine's sickening confession. I explained the accelerated timeline, the high-rise launch party, and their horrific decision to legally murder Odessa next Saturday morning. David remained silent, processing the terrifying escalation. Sienna, David said, his voice grave. If Preston is accelerating his exit scam by a week, we cannot wait for a legal injunction. By the time a judge reviews the fraud evidence, he will be sitting on a beach in the Cayman Islands, and your grandmother will be dead. We have to trap him outside the legal system. I looked down at my sleeping son and took a deep breath. Then we buy his debt. I declared the idea, solidifying into a concrete plan. Preston owes millions to an underground sports betting syndicate and several predatory lenders. If I legally acquire his promissory notes, I become his sole primary creditor. I can instantly call in the debt, seize his assets, and freeze his passport before he steps foot on that airplane. David whistled, shocked by the magnitude of my proposal. You are talking about swimming with sharks. These underground lenders are ruthless. They do not negotiate with grieving widows, and they certainly do not sell debt portfolios to random citizens without undeniable leverage. I pulled up the encrypted files David sent me earlier. I am not a grieving widow anymore, I stated firmly, and I have the leverage. We know Preston is planning to default on their loans and flee the country in 6 days. The syndicate does not know about the Cayman Islands accounts or the secret paralegal. We will offer them a hostile takeover of his debt at a premium, using his impending flight as the ultimate bargaining chip. Within 24 hours, David utilized his underworld contacts to arrange a clandestine meeting. I did not walk into the sleek, windowless boardroom in downtown Atlanta as Sienna, the struggling recipe developer. I walked in as the executive representative of Oasis Holdings, a shadow LLC, David constructed to mask my true identity. Sitting across the polished mahogany table were 3 intimidating men wearing tailored suits. They were the apex predators of Atlanta's shadow economy, the men who held the leash, choking my arrogant brother-in-law. I did not wait for them to offer me a seat. I stood at the head of the table, opened my briefcase, and threw the forensic accounting files directly onto the reflective wood surface. Preston is defaulting on your loans next Friday night, I announced, my voice devoid of fear. He is hosting a massive launch party for the Apex Tower to collect a final round of elite investor funding. The next morning, he is boarding a private jet to the Cayman Islands with his mistress. He is leaving his wife and my mother to face the federal fallout, and he is leaving you with absolutely nothing. The lead lender, a man with completely cold, dead eyes, picked up the printed flight itineraries and the offshore bank routing numbers. He meticulously reviewed the undeniable proof of Preston's grand exit scam. The arrogance in his posture stiffened into genuine, dangerous anger. He realized the Golden Boy investment banker had been playing them for absolute fools. You brought us a warning, the lead lender said, his voice a threatening rumble. But you want something in return. You want to purchase his entire debt portfolio and take the legal collection rights for yourself. Why? I maintained unblinking eye contact. Because I want the immense pleasure of destroying him myself, I replied coldly. I am offering to buy his debt at exactly 110% of its current market value. You get your money back with a guaranteed profit, and you avoid the federal headache of chasing a fugitive across international borders. I get the legal authority to financially evict him, seize his fake empire, and completely ruin his life. The 3 men exchanged a calculated look. They were businessmen, and the offer of guaranteed profit over an impending total loss was incredibly appealing. However, they were also ruthless predators who never took unnecessary risks. The lead lender leaned forward, folding his hands deliberately on the mahogany table. We accept the structural premise of your hostile takeover, Oasis Holdings, he stated smoothly. But your shadow corporation has 0 credit history. We are not transferring the legal rights to a $5 million debt portfolio based on a mere promise. We require ironclad, immediate collateral. If you want the legal authority to crush Preston next Friday night, you have to put your own life on the line right now. He slid a dense, complicated contract across the polished table. It was a binding, irrevocable assignment of future assets. To secure this transfer, the lender explained, you must sign over the exclusive legal rights to the $200,000 monthly trust fund your grandmother established. If your grand plan fails, if Preston manages to board that plane next week, we legally take your trust fund forever. Your son gets absolutely nothing. You will be permanently destitute. Are you willing to gamble your child's entire financial future just to destroy your brother-in-law? I stared at the heavy pen resting on top of the contract. My heart pounded relentlessly against my ribs, a rhythm of pure determination. If I missed a single step, if Valerie or Jasmine tipped Preston off, I would lose everything. I grabbed the heavy silver pen and signed my name. The lead lender scrutinized my signature, his cold eyes registering genuine respect. He slid a thick portfolio across the table. It contained every defaulted loan agreement. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was the sole owner of a $5 million financial guillotine, with my brother-in-law's neck resting on the block. I packed the documents and walked out. Back at my freezing apartment, reality contrasted sharply with the empire I now controlled. Before I could strategize my next move, a sharp knock battered my door. Standing in the dingy hallway, looking utterly repulsed, was my mother. Valerie had come completely alone. I discreetly activated the voice recorder on my smartphone before turning the deadbolt. Valerie barged past me. She looked at the peeling wallpaper with blatant revulsion. "This place is a biohazard, Sienna," Valerie announced, turning with supreme maternal disappointment. "This is the consequence you earn when you refuse to play by the rules. I am here to offer you a way out." She unclasped her handbag and pulled out a white envelope. She tossed it onto my scratched kitchen counter next to the baby formula. "There is a certified cashier's check in that envelope for exactly $10,000, Valerie stated, raising her chin with immense superiority. "Along with it is a standard non-disclosure agreement and a formal, irrevocable renunciation of any and all claims to your grandmother's estate. You are going to sign those papers right now, Sienna. You will take that money, pack up your baby, and move to a different state by tomorrow morning. If you do this quietly, Preston has generously agreed to call off Child Protective Services. You get to keep your child, and we get to finalize Odessa's estate in peace." I stared at the envelope, a dark, bitter laugh bubbling up in the back of my throat. $10,000. They had stolen $1.2 million of my survival money, forced my grandmother onto her deathbed, and were preparing to flee the country with millions more. And my mother genuinely believed she could buy my silence for the price of a used car. $10,000, I asked, keeping my voice low and intentionally unsteady, playing the part of the desperate broken daughter she desperately wanted me to be. "Mom." Preston stole over $1 million from my widow's fund. He drained the money Julian left to keep Leo safe. How can you stand there and offer me pennies from my own stolen trust? Valerie rolled her eyes, completely devoid of any maternal empathy. "Oh, please stop with the dramatic victim narrative, Sienna. It is exhausting. Preston did what he had to do to keep this family at the very top of Atlanta's elite society. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain our image, to secure our places at the country club, to host the charity galas that keep our family name relevant? You chose to marry a middle-class architect. Jasmine married a financial visionary. We needed those funds to support Preston's real estate ventures, which elevate all of us." "He is a fraud, Mom," I pushed back, making sure my phone caught every single word. "He does not have a real estate empire. He used my stolen money to pay off violent gambling debts and lease his luxury cars. He is bankrupting you. Why would you protect a man who is literally stealing from your own mother's empire?" Valerie let out a sharp, condescending scoff, stepping closer to me with a look of pure toxic arrogance. She completely took the bait. "Because having a wealthy white savior in this family opens doors that your grandmother's hair care money simply never could." Valerie confessed, her voice dripping with venomous pride. "You do not understand how Atlanta high society works, Sienna. Being a wealthy black family is one thing, But having a connected elite white investment banker as a son-in-law, it legitimized us to the old money crowd. It secured Jasmine's place on the most exclusive hospital boards. I knew Preston was pulling money from the trust to cover his leverage gaps. I authorized the transfers myself. I gladly looked the other way because the prestige he brings to our family image is worth 10 times whatever he borrowed from your little widow's fund. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was breathtaking. She was openly admitting to facilitating a massive federal crime simply to maintain a racist, superficial illusion of prestige at a country club. She had entirely sold out her own flesh and blood for a fake status symbol. You knew he was stealing, I clarified, making absolutely certain the recording captured the exact context of her horrific admission. You deliberately helped him forge Grandma Odessa's signature to drain my trust fund, knowing it would leave Leo and me completely destitute. I did what was necessary for the greater good of this family's legacy, Valerie declared coldly, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at the envelope. You were never going to contribute to our social standing anyway, Sienna. Now stop whining, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and take the $10,000 before I let Preston call the authorities to take your baby. I looked at the pathetic envelope on my counter, and then I looked directly into my mother's cold, empty eyes. I reached out, picked up the cashier's check, and slowly, deliberately tore it into tiny, unrecognizable pieces, letting them fall like snow onto the broken linoleum floor. Get out of my apartment, I commanded, my voice dropping the terrified facade, entirely replacing it with lethal, absolute authority. Valerie gasped, her face twisting in pure outrage. You stupid, arrogant girl, you are making the biggest mistake of your miserable life. You are going to lose that baby. Get out, I shouted, slamming the door. I ended the voice recording and hit save. My mother had just arrogantly confessed to a multi-million-dollar felony. I uploaded the explosive file to David's secure server. The financial trap was perfectly set, but my phone suddenly flashed with an urgent encrypted text message that made my blood run entirely cold. The notification on my screen was not a standard text message. It was routed through an encrypted messaging application I had downloaded months ago, at the specific request of Clara, the dedicated oncology nurse, who had cared for Julian during his final days. Clara had recently transferred to the VIP neurological wing at Atlanta General, the exact same floor where they were currently holding my grandmother captive. I tapped the screen with trembling fingers, my eyes rapidly scanning the block of urgent, terrified text. Sienna, you need to get here right now, Clara wrote. Odessa briefly regained consciousness 10 minutes ago. She is weak, but she is completely lucid. Preston is already here. He brought a sleazy notary and some corporate lawyer I do not recognize. They are physically forcing a pen into her hand to sign a brand new updated will and a permanent medical proxy. He also hired 2 massive armed private security guards. They are blocking the door and turning away all hospital staff. If she signs those papers, he gains total irreversible legal immunity over the entire estate. You have maybe 30 minutes before they sedate her again. My heart slammed against my ribcage like a trapped animal. Preston was executing a desperate, lethal backup plan. If he successfully coerced a vulnerable, recovering stroke victim into legally signing over the empire, my hostile takeover of his debt would become a useless, drawn-out civil litigation nightmare. He could legally liquidate the remaining trust funds to pay me off, sever his ties to the family, and still easily flee to the Cayman Islands as a multimillionaire. I could absolutely not let him get away with it. I sprinted across my freezing apartment and banged wildly on the door of Mrs. Gable, the kind elderly retired teacher who lived across the hall. I thrust a sleeping Leo in his diaper bag into her surprised arms, begging her to watch him for just 2 hours. Without waiting for her inevitable questions, I ran down the stairwell and jumped into my beat-up sedan. I broke at least 4 different traffic laws speeding through the icy Atlanta streets, my knuckles turning completely white against the steering wheel. I pulled into the hospital parking garage, my mind racing through a dozen different chaotic infiltration scenarios. Walking through the front lobby, as Sienna, the disgraced, locked-out granddaughter, would instantly trigger Preston's security team. I needed to become entirely invisible. I bypassed the main elevators and slipped through the heavy metal fire doors leading into the hospital's bustling service corridors. The basement level smelled strongly of harsh industrial bleach and boiling laundry. I ducked behind a row of massive stainless steel washing machines, watching the busy hospital staff move frantically around me. A tired-looking environmental services worker carelessly tossed his bright blue oversized hospital scrubs and a disposable surgical mask onto a nearby folding chair before stepping into the employee break room. I did not hesitate for a single second. I grabbed the baggy blue scrubs, quickly pulling them on directly over my jeans and sweater. I fastened the blue surgical mask tightly over my nose and mouth, pulling my hair up into a messy bun, and grabbed a rolling plastic biohazard bin from the hallway. I lowered my head perfectly, blending into the anonymous invisible army of workers who kept the massive hospital running. I took the service elevator straight up to the VIP neurological wing. When the heavy metal doors slid open, the stark, unnerving reality of the situation hit me. The corridor was unnaturally quiet, heavily draped in expensive wood paneling and soft lighting. Standing directly outside room 412 were two gigantic men wearing tailored black suits and visible earpieces. They looked like professional mercenaries, not standard hospital security. They stood with their arms firmly crossed, scanning the quiet hallway with cold, predatory eyes. I pushed the squeaking biohazard bin forward, keeping my head bowed and my posture utterly submissive. My pulse was roaring so loudly in my ears I was genuinely afraid they could hear it. As I approached the heavy mahogany door of Odessa's suite, the guard on the left immediately stepped forward, raising a massive, intimidating hand to block my path. "No entry," the guard barked, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "The family has explicitly requested 0 interruptions. The patient is resting. Come back on the next shift." "I have strict orders from the charge nurse," I replied deliberately, muffling my voice behind the surgical mask and keeping my eyes glued to the polished floor. "There is a biohazard spill protocol in the attached bathroom. If I do not clear the medical waste right now, infection control will literally shut down this entire floor, and you will have to explain to the health department why you violated federal sanitary regulations." The two guards exchanged a hesitant, annoyed look. They were highly paid muscle, entirely unfamiliar with strict hospital compliance codes. The threat of triggering a massive federal health inspection was enough to make them second-guess their rigid orders. "Make it quick," the second guard grunted, stepping aside just enough to let my plastic bin squeeze through. "Do not speak to the patient. Do not look at the family. Get the trash and get out, or I will personally throw you down the stairwell." I nodded silently, pushing the cart past them and slipping through the heavy wooden door. The moment it clicked shut behind me, the suffocating atmosphere of the hospital room enveloped me. The air was thick with the smell of sterile rubbing alcohol and cheap cologne. My grandmother lay on the massive hospital bed, looking pale and incredibly fragile. The medical monitors beeped in a rapid, stressed rhythm. Standing over her, clutching a thick stack of legal documents, was Preston. Beside him stood a notary holding a pen. Preston was violently gripping Odessa's frail wrist, attempting to force her shaking fingers around the expensive pen to sign her life and my son's future away. I did not hesitate. I shoved the heavy plastic biohazard bin forward, slamming it directly into the back of Preston's knees. The impact broke his grip on my grandmother's frail wrist, causing him to cry out in pain. Preston stumbled, dropping the thick stack of documents onto the hospital floor with a loud slap. He spun around, his face twisted in fury, expecting to scream at a clumsy janitor. I stood straight, ripped the blue surgical mask off my face, and threw it into the trash. The sneer on his face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew I had caught him committing a massive federal crime. The sleazy notary took one terrified look at my furious expression and physically backed away from the hospital bed, his hands raised in surrender. I turned my attention directly to him. "If you witness that signature," I warned, my voice deadly calm and echoing sharply off the walls, "you are officially an accessory to multi-million-dollar elder abuse and corporate wire fraud. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is already tracking his offshore accounts. If you value your freedom, you will walk out of that door right now." The cowardly notary did not need to be told twice. He dropped his expensive silver pen on the mattress, grabbed his briefcase, and practically sprinted toward the corner of the room, desperately trying to distance himself from Preston. My brother-in-law lunged forward, raising his clenched fist to strike me across the face, but a raspy, commanding voice stopped him dead in his tracks. "If you touch my granddaughter," Odessa wheezed, her voice weak but dripping with absolute lethal authority, "I will spend my last dying breath ensuring you rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." Preston froze instantly, his fists suspended uselessly in the air. He stared at the hospital bed in complete horror. The corrupt doctors he bribed had confidently assured him that my grandmother would remain heavily sedated for at least another 48 hours. He had vastly underestimated her relentless willpower. I quickly stepped around the biohazard bin and rushed to her bedside. I gently took her cold, shaking hands in mine, feeling an overwhelming surge of relief. She looked at me, her sharp brown eyes perfectly lucid despite the messy tangle of medical wires and the steady, urgent beeping of the heart monitor. She did not need to ask what was happening in her suite. She already knew her legacy was under vicious attack. "We do not have much time, Grandma," I said urgently, pulling my smartphone from the deep pocket of my oversized scrubs. "Preston is trying to steal everything and Mom is actively helping him do it. I have the ultimate proof." I opened the encrypted audio file I had recorded just a few short hours ago in my freezing apartment. I turned the volume to the absolute maximum and pressed play. Valerie's toxic, arrogant voice filled the quiet hospital room. She proudly confessed to authorizing the fraudulent transfer of my widow's fund. She callously admitted to looking the other way, while Preston continuously drained the primary family trusts, explicitly stating that having a wealthy white savior in the family significantly elevated her social status at the country club. I watched my grandmother's face as the awful audio played. The physical weakness of her stroke vanished entirely completely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and profound fury. Her own daughter had sold her out for a fake country club membership, treating our legacy like cheap currency. I did not stop there. I immediately pulled up the forensic accounting files David had securely transmitted to my device. I held the glowing screen directly in front of Odessa's eyes. I showed her the offshore bank routing numbers located in the Cayman Islands. I showed her the undeniable proof of his empty shell companies, his massive underground gambling debts, and the heavily leveraged mortgages he had secretly taken out against her sprawling Buckhead estate. Finally, I showed her the 2 first-class one-way airplane tickets booked for next Saturday morning. One ticket was for Preston. The second ticket belonged to a 24-year-old paralegal. He is planning to bankrupt the family legally, blindside Jasmine with divorce papers, and flee the country the morning after his luxury high-rise launch party. I explained rapidly. Preston stood completely paralyzed by the door, watching his entire fake life burn straight to the ground. He thinks he has won because he systematically isolated you from your true allies. I told my grandmother, quickly pulling a thick, meticulously drafted legal document from my coat pocket. "Marcus expertly prepared this today. It is an ironclad, irrevocable power of attorney. If you sign this right now, you legally grant me absolute, unrestricted control over the entire family empire. I will systematically freeze him out of every single corporate account. I will legally seize his assets, and I will personally dismantle his pathetic life piece by piece." Preston suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed trance. He realized his entire glorious exit strategy was rapidly evaporating right before his eyes. He screamed at the top of his lungs, desperately calling for his armed private security guards waiting in the hallway. I handed the heavy silver pen to my grandmother. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Odessa, furious and completely lucid, signed the ironclad, irrevocable power of attorney, granting me absolute control over the family empire, just as the heavy wooden door crashed open entirely. The 2 massive, heavily armed private security guards lunged into the quiet hospital suite, fully expecting to find me violently attacking Preston. To ensure total victory, I did not flinch. I simply held the freshly signed document high, turning directly toward them. They stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the legal seal, transferring all authority, wealth, and estate decisions directly into my awaiting hands. Behind them, Preston fell to his knees on the sterile linoleum floor, a broken, defeated shell trembling uncontrollably. The absolute fear in his wide blue eyes was a beautiful sight, confirming he knew his reign was over. I firmly informed the guards that as of this exact second, I held absolute legal authority over my grandmother's medical care and the entire corporate estate, paying their exorbitant salaries. I coldly instructed them to physically remove Preston from the premises immediately or face severe federal trespassing charges. The mercenaries looked closely at the official legal seal, looked down at the pathetic man sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, and made the easy choice. They realized their paychecks depended on me now. They aggressively grabbed Preston by his expensive suit jacket, hauled him roughly to his feet, and dragged him out of the room without a single word of protest. I gently kissed my grandmother's warm forehead, promising her I would successfully finish this brutal war, and walked out into the crisp Atlanta afternoon with my empire resting safely inside my tote bag. I immediately drove straight to a nondescript gray office building located deep in downtown Atlanta. David was waiting for me in the quiet lobby, his posture rigid with intense professional anticipation. He swiftly escorted me up to a highly secure conference room on the 12th floor. Sitting around a sleek, frosted glass table were 3 stern agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. They did not offer warm smiles or polite pleasantries. They were strictly business, their sharp eyes assessing me as I took my seat. I opened my briefcase and proudly handed over the signed power of attorney, legally validating my immense authority to act on behalf of the stolen family trusts. Then David activated the digital projector, casting the explosive forensic accounting files onto the stark white wall. We meticulously walked the federal agents through Preston's entire criminal operation, step by agonizing step. We showed them the forged signatures on my diverted widow's fund, his massive underground gambling debts, and the heavily leveraged mortgages secretly draining my mother's entire estate. The agents visibly tightened their jaws as we exposed how Valerie knowingly facilitated the embezzlement just to maintain her pathetic country club status. Finally, we displayed the offshore bank routing numbers hidden in the Cayman Islands and the 2 first-class, one-way airplane tickets booked for tomorrow morning. The lead FBI investigator, a formidable woman named Agent Miller, leaned forward and intertwined her fingers. She acknowledged the sheer magnitude of the fraud and confirmed they had been quietly monitoring his shell companies for a week. However, her next words sent a sharp, terrifying chill directly down my spine. Agent Miller explicitly explained the harsh, complicated reality of federal prosecution against high-profile, incredibly wealthy suspects. The justice system often inadvertently protected elite criminals who could afford to manipulate the loopholes. Preston had multiple layers of highly expensive corporate lawyers retained precisely for this exact type of sudden legal emergency. If the FBI boldly moved to arrest him right now, based solely on the current digital paper trail we provided, his ruthless legal team would instantly file an emergency injunction to halt the process. They would falsely argue the transfers were fully authorized family investments, intentionally tying the federal investigation up in a lengthy, infuriating bureaucratic nightmare for several tedious months. By the time the complex warrants finally cleared the inevitable judicial hurdles and the stubborn judges, Preston and his secret paralegal mistress would be safely lounging on a sunlit beach in a non-extradition country, enjoying stolen cocktails. To successfully execute an immediate, undeniable arrest before that chartered private jet took off tomorrow morning, the FBI desperately needed a fatal, unspinnable mistake from the target himself. They needed Preston to physically authorize the final massive wire transfer, completely draining the estate while under direct, active federal surveillance. Or they needed a highly public, undeniable verbal confession detailing his grand exit scam in full. Without that real-time concrete evidence to satisfy the immense burden of proof, the strict legal technicalities would absolutely allow him to easily slip right through their grasping fingers, keeping his stolen millions and vanishing forever. David looked at me, the immense weight of the federal ultimatum hanging heavily in the quiet conference room. Preston was severely cornered, but a cornered, desperate animal was incredibly dangerous. The stakes were astronomical, and everything relied on my ability to outsmart a master manipulator. I knew my brother-in-law significantly better than the federal agents did. I intimately knew his massive ego, his desperate need for public validation, and his profound, blinding arrogance. I confidently stood up from the frosted glass table and looked Agent Miller directly in her eyes. I told her that Preston was hosting a massive, highly publicized launch party for his fake luxury high-rise development tonight. The event was the most anticipated social gathering of the year. He fully planned to use the elite gala to collect a final round of investor funding before permanently vanishing at dawn. I firmly promised the federal agents that I would walk right into the center of that glittering high society event. I would not fail. I would publicly corner him into executing that final offshore wire transfer, and I would absolutely force him to confess to every single crime in front of the entire city. I instructed the FBI to quietly and strategically station their tactical arrest teams directly at the venue doors, because I was fully prepared and going to hand-deliver his absolute financial destruction on a shiny, polished silver platter that very night. The crisp evening air of downtown Atlanta was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras. Preston's highly publicized launch party for the Apex Tower had completely blocked off 3 entire city blocks. Floodlights swept across the dark winter sky, illuminating the towering, half-finished glass structure that served as the fraudulent centerpiece of his fake real estate empire. A sprawling red carpet led directly into the venue's lavishly decorated grand pavilion, where a small army of valets scrambled to park a continuous stream of luxury European sports cars. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city's most elite politicians, wealthy socialites, and high-stakes investors. At the very center of the opulent room, holding court like absolute royalty, were my mother and my sister. Valerie was draped in a custom-beaded silver evening gown, a flute of vintage champagne permanently affixed to her manicured hand. She laughed loudly at a joke made by a city councilman, tossing her head back with practiced theatrical elegance. Jasmine stood right beside her, wearing a skin-tight scarlet dress and dripping in diamonds that Preston had purchased using my dead husband's money. They were eagerly posing for a local society magazine photographer, soaking up the flashing camera bulbs with greedy, insatiable delight. Across the room, Preston was expertly working the crowd of wealthy investors. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, flashing his bright, predatory smile as he confidently shook hands and slapped backs. He was actively charming them, spinning a web of lucrative lies to secure the final round of elite funding he desperately needed for his offshore escape. To the untrained eye, they were the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. They were the golden family, untouchable and supreme. But I knew the terrifying, hollow truth. I knew the FBI tactical teams were already quietly positioning themselves in the dark alleyways surrounding the building, waiting for my exact signal. I did not arrive in a heavily leveraged limousine. I stepped out of an unassuming black sedan, my posture rigid with absolute cold determination. I had permanently shed the fraying thrift store sweaters that marked me as the family's pathetic, grieving scapegoat. Tonight, I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored crimson power suit that demanded immediate, unquestionable authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, and a pair of pointed-toe stilettos clicked rhythmically against the concrete pavement. I did not carry a baby bag. I carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the forensic financial documents, the newly minted debt assignment contracts, and the irrevocable power of attorney signed by my grandmother. I bypassed the crowded press line and walked directly up the plush red carpet. The massive gold-leaf double doors of the pavilion were heavily guarded by a team of private-suited bouncers holding digital guest lists. I did not slow my pace. I simply flashed a premium VIP investor badge I had easily procured through my newly established shadow corporation. The guards immediately unhooked the velvet rope, pulling the heavy doors open and allowing me to step straight into the lion's den. The sheer volume of the party washed over me, a chaotic blend of clinking crystal and booming jazz music. I stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, looking down at the glittering sea of thieves and enablers. It took exactly 20 seconds for the illusion to crack. Jasmine was the very first person to spot me. She was in the middle of handing her empty champagne glass to a passing waiter when her eyes casually drifted up toward the staircase landing. She froze entirely. Her manicured hand slipped, sending the expensive crystal flute crashing onto the polished marble floor. The sharp, shattering sound caused Valerie to turn her head in annoyance, ready to scold her daughter for the clumsy mistake. Then Valerie saw me. All the manufactured color instantly drained from my mother's meticulously contoured face. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as her brain violently rejected the visual input. She had fully expected me to be shivering in a dark, freezing apartment, crying over my impending homelessness and the terrifying threat of Child Protective Services. She certainly did not expect me to walk into the most exclusive event of the year, wearing a suit that cost more than her emerald gala dress, radiating pure lethal confidence. The absolute panic in Valerie's eyes quickly morphed into a rabid, uncontrollable fury. Her perfectly crafted socialite mask slipped entirely, exposing the vicious, controlling monster lurking just beneath the surface. She did not politely excuse herself from the wealthy politicians surrounding her. She aggressively pushed past a state senator, her silver gown swishing violently as she marched directly toward the bottom of the grand staircase. "What do you think you are doing here?" Valerie hissed, her voice, a sharp, venomous whisper, intended to stay below the booming jazz music. She glared up at me, her eyes darting frantically to see if any journalists had noticed my arrival. "You have absolutely no right to be in this building, Sienna. You were explicitly trespassed from every single family property." "This is not a family property, Mom," I replied evenly, slowly descending the marble steps until we were standing eye to eye. "This is Preston's event, and as a major investor, I have every right to attend." "You are a delusional liar." Valerie spat, her hands trembling with rage. Valerie turned sharply and frantically waved her arm. "Security, get over here right now." Two massive men wearing black suits immediately broke away from the main entrance. "Throw this woman out into the street immediately," Valerie commanded, pointing a sharp nail directly at my chest. The larger security guard stepped aggressively into my personal space. He reached out his massive hand to drag me backward. I did not move. I stared directly into his intimidating eyes, my posture unyielding, completely ready to trigger the explosive trap. The heavy hand of the lead security guard clamped down on my shoulder, his thick fingers digging into the custom fabric of my crimson suit. He expected me to flinch, to crumble under physical intimidation that men like him used to control guests. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my tailored jacket with absolute unnerving calmness. I did not pull out a weapon or a generic invitation. I pulled out a matte black titanium keycard attached to a lanyard bearing the unmistakable, embossed silver logo of Oasis Holdings. I held it up, pressing the cold metal directly against the center of the guard's chest. I instructed him to look very closely at the credentials he was currently trying to physically assault. The guard narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed, but his gaze fell upon the silver lettering. His aggressive grip on my shoulder instantly loosened. The second guard, standing slightly behind him, leaned in to inspect the badge. The color rapidly drained from both of their faces. They were not directly employed by Preston. They were elite private contractors hired by the building's central management firm, and just 48 hours ago, Oasis Holdings had legally purchased the absolute entirety of that management firm's outstanding debt. "Read the name on this card," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that only the two massive men could hear. "I am the sole executive director of Oasis Holdings. My corporation currently owns the primary mortgage on this exact venue, the construction loans funding the steel in these walls, and the exclusive payroll contract for your specific security firm." If you attempt to forcefully remove the primary stakeholder of this entire building from her own property, you will not just be fired tonight. I will personally ensure that your agency is permanently blacklisted from every major commercial contract in the state of Georgia. The lead guard swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his thick throat. He recognized the corporate logo. He had likely received the urgent internal memo yesterday morning regarding the sudden hostile change in upper management. He immediately let go of my jacket, taking 2 deliberate steps backward. He lowered his head formally, crossing his hands in front of his waist in a textbook stance of absolute submission. The second guard quickly mirrored his defensive, apologetic posture. They had instantly realized that protecting the fragile ego of a shrieking socialite was not worth destroying their entire professional careers. Valerie stood paralyzed on the bottom step of the grand marble staircase. Her emerald silk gown pooled around her trembling ankles. She stared at the 2 retreating security guards in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Her mouth hung open, her perfectly painted lips quivering as her brain spectacularly failed to comprehend the sudden shift in power. "What are you doing?" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. She pointed a frantic, shaking finger at me. "I gave you a direct order to throw her out. She is a trespasser. She is a dangerous, unstable woman trying to ruin my son-in-law's launch party. Remove her from this building immediately." The lead guard did not even look at my mother. He kept his eyes respectfully averted from me and spoke with a stiff professional monotone. "I apologize, ma'am, but we cannot fulfill that request. This guest possesses top-tier executive clearance. She has absolute unrestricted access to the entire premises." Valerie gasped, taking a staggering step back as if she had been physically struck. "Executive clearance? Are you completely insane?" she demanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch that began drawing the curious, judgmental stares of nearby politicians and wealthy investors. "She is broke. She lives in a slum. She does not even have enough money to pay her heating bill." I stepped closer to my mother, closing the physical distance until I could smell the expensive, cloying perfume radiating from her sweating skin. "You really should have paid closer attention to the legal documents you blindly signed for Preston," I said quietly, a cold, merciless smile spreading across my face. "You assumed I was busy crying in the dark, Valerie. You thought throwing $10,000 at me would buy my permanent silence. But while you were out shopping for designer dresses with stolen money, I was busy buying the exact chains wrapping around your golden son-in-law's neck." Valerie's eyes widened with pure, unfiltered terror. The arrogant, controlling matriarch was finally beginning to understand that the ground beneath her feet was rapidly disintegrating. Jasmine jogged over her scarlet dress, shimmering under the chandeliers, looking wildly confused by the escalating scene. She grabbed our mother's arm, casting a disgusted, bewildered look at my immaculate crimson suit. "Mom, what is going on here?" Jasmine whined, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. "Why is she inside? The press is going to see her." Before Valerie could utter a single panicked word of warning to her precious daughter, the massive crystal chandeliers above us suddenly dimmed. The soft, elegant jazz music faded away, replaced by a booming cinematic bass drop that echoed through the grand pavilion. A single blinding white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the massive main stage. The crowded room of elite investors and socialites turned their attention away from our tense standoff, clapping politely as the guest of honor stepped confidently into the bright light. Preston approached the microphone, adjusting his bespoke tuxedo with sickening, unearned arrogance. He flashed his signature predatory smile, entirely unaware that the woman he thought he had completely destroyed was standing just 50 feet away, holding the literal keys to his financial execution. He gripped the edges of the podium, puffing out his chest to deliver his grand, deceitful speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston announced, his voice echoing across the silent room, "tonight we do not just celebrate the spectacular launch of the Apex Tower. I am thrilled to officially announce my total exclusive management over the entire Odessa family estate." The applause following his arrogant declaration was deafening. The wealthy investors clapped enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the fact that they were applauding a ruthless criminal who had just publicly confessed to stealing my grandmother's life's work. Preston beamed under the blinding spotlight, soaking in the unearned adoration with a sickening level of pride. He raised his right hand, gesturing grandly toward the massive digital screens suspended high above the lavish stage. He held a sleek, wireless remote ready to unveil his crowning achievement. He pressed the button to start what was supposed to be a highly polished, expensive promotional video showcasing the fake Apex Tower. The massive screens initially flickered to life with a soaring aerial shot of the Atlanta skyline, accompanied by soaring, inspirational orchestral music. For exactly 5 seconds, the illusion held perfectly. Then my thumb pressed the master override button on my synchronized tablet. The swelling orchestral music abruptly cut out, replaced by a harsh, grating burst of static feedback that made several socialites physically flinch and cover their ears. The beautiful aerial footage of the city skyline violently glitched, dissolving into a stark, blindingly bright white background. Preston furiously clicked his wireless remote again and again, his perfect predatory smile instantly faltering as he realized he had completely lost control of the presentation. He looked frantically toward the soundboard booth at the back of the room, angrily waving his arms at the confused technicians. The technicians scrambled helplessly over their mixing consoles, but they were locked out. I had established a secure, impenetrable digital backdoor into the hotel's primary audio-visual network during my college years, and I was currently dominating the entire system from the palm of my hand. The stark white background on the massive screens suddenly populated with crisp, high-definition black text. It was not a marketing slogan, it was a highly detailed certified banking ledger. A collective gasp swept through the crowded pavilion as the elite guests began to read the massive numbers projected above them. I had prominently displayed the exact, undeniable offshore bank routing information that Preston had desperately tried to bury in the Cayman Islands. Every single stolen dollar from my widow's fund, every illegally diverted cent from my grandmother's primary trust accounts, and every fraudulent bridge loan he had ever signed was explicitly detailed for the entire city to see. Next to the damning financial ledgers, a secondary window popped open on the massive screens. It displayed a high-resolution, undeniable scan of the fraudulent estate transfer documents. The screen then zoomed in meticulously on the signature line, placing the forged signature directly next to a certified copy of my grandmother's actual legal handwriting. The catastrophic discrepancies were obvious even to the untrained eye. Preston was publicly exposed as a desperate, sloppy forger. "Turn it off!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic as he violently slammed his fist against the wooden podium. "Cut the power to the projectors right now. This is a malicious cyber attack. Someone is trying to ruin this company." No one moved to help him. The wealthy investors who had been cheering for him just seconds ago were now staring at the undeniable proof of his colossal financial crimes. But the absolute worst was yet to come. I tapped my tablet screen one more time, delivering the final devastating personal blow. The financial documents vanished, replaced instantly by a series of crystal-clear, high-definition photographs. The images were incredibly damning. They featured Preston passionately kissing a young, blonde woman who was most certainly not my sister. The photographs captured them dining at exclusive romantic restaurants, relaxing on private, secluded beaches, and walking hand in hand into expensive luxury boutiques. The young woman was his 24-year-old paralegal, the secret mistress he had been lavishly funding with the money he stole from my starving, freezing infant son. The final image to appear on the massive screens was the absolute, undeniable nail in his coffin. It was a pristine, unredacted screenshot of 2 confirmed first-class one-way airplane tickets to the Cayman Islands. The departure date prominently displayed was for tomorrow morning at exactly 6 o'clock. The passenger names printed boldly in black ink were Preston and his young blonde mistress. He had never intended to stay and build a luxury high-rise in Atlanta. He was actively planning to take their money, abandon his heavily leveraged debts, and permanently flee the country at dawn. The entire launch party was nothing but a sickening, desperate exit scam. The deafening silence in the grand pavilion shattered into a million pieces. The absolute betrayal was laid bare in high-definition color for the entire city to witness. I looked away from the massive screens and shifted my gaze directly toward my sister. Jasmine stood near the front of the stage, her scarlet dress glowing under the ambient light. She was trembling violently, her hands tightly clutching the diamond necklace draped across her collarbone. For 5 years, she had built her entire identity around being the beautiful elite wife of a wealthy financial genius. She had viciously mocked my poverty, actively participated in my cruel banishment, and gleefully anticipated the calculated murder of our grandmother, all to secure a lavish lifestyle that was completely fake. Jasmine stared at the undeniable proof of her husband's impending departure. He was leaving her behind to face the catastrophic federal fallout of his massive multi-million-dollar fraud. The absolute illusion of her perfect, untouchable life disintegrated instantly into 1,000 jagged, irreparable pieces. A raw, guttural scream ripped violently from her burning throat, a sound of pure, unhinged agony and utter public humiliation. Jasmine did not gracefully retreat or attempt to safely save face in front of her stunned, whispering high society friends. She completely snapped under the crushing weight of his ultimate betrayal. She dropped her heavy diamond-encrusted designer handbag, hiked up the tightly tailored skirt of her incredibly expensive scarlet dress, and lunged violently onto the main stage like a vicious wounded animal seeking immediate bloody revenge. Jasmine collided with Preston's chest, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails instantly digging into the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo. She screamed hysterically, beating her fists against his shoulders as he frantically tried to push her away without losing his footing on the polished wooden stage. The wealthy investors in the front row physically recoiled, shielding their champagne glasses from the flying debris of their shattered golden couple. Preston stumbled backward, desperately grabbing Jasmine's wrists to stop her relentless physical assault, his face flushed with panicked sweat. He hissed vicious orders for her to calm down, but she was completely unhinged. The reality of his offshore betrayal had fractured her fragile, materialistic mind. Valerie could not bear the spectacular public destruction of her country club reputation for another second. The sight of her golden daughter physically brawling on a stage like a common street fighter pushed my mother past her absolute breaking point. She did not run to comfort Jasmine or to drag Preston away. She turned her wild, bloodshot eyes directly toward me. In her twisted, status-obsessed brain, none of this was Preston's fault for being a thief. It was my fault for publicly exposing him. She hiked up her emerald silk gown and aggressively marched toward the soundboard where I stood, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You malicious, ungrateful wretch!" Valerie shrieked, entirely abandoning her polished socialite persona. She stormed up the side steps of the stage, her high heels clicking violently against the wooden floorboards. "You are completely destroying this family. You are humiliating us in front of the entire city. I will make you pay for this." She raised her right hand high into the air, her heavy diamond rings catching the bright stage lights. She fully intended to slap me across the face with every ounce of physical strength she possessed, desperate to forcefully assert her maternal dominance, and literally beat me back into submission. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stared directly into her furious eyes, completely prepared to physically block her strike. Before her descending hand could even inch closer to my cheek, a booming, thunderous voice suddenly vibrated through the massive speaker system overhead. "If you lay a single finger on my granddaughter Valerie, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life scrubbing floors in a federal penitentiary." The sheer, raw authority in that raspy voice caused my mother to instantly freeze in her tracks. Her raised hand hovered uselessly in the air. The entire grand pavilion plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. The guests stopped whispering. Jasmine and Preston abruptly ceased their violent scuffle. Every single person in the room instantly recognized that unmistakable commanding tone. The heavy velvet curtains at the far right side of the main stage slowly parted. The crowd gasped. Rolling forward in a sleek motorized wheelchair was my grandmother Odessa. She was no longer the frail, comatose patient lying helpless in a hospital bed, surrounded by Preston's armed mercenaries. She was sitting rigidly upright, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. Flanking her wheelchair like an impenetrable fortress were a dozen stern-faced federal attorneys and elite corporate litigators, all carrying thick leather briefcases. The medical machinery was completely gone, replaced by the sheer terrifying aura of a business mogul reclaiming her stolen throne. Valerie's raised arm dropped limply to her side. She stared at her mother in absolute paralyzing horror. "Mother," Valerie whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of undeniable panic. "The hospital said you were incapacitated. They said you were not going to wake up." Odessa sneered, guiding her wheelchair forward until she was positioned directly in the center of the brightly lit stage. "You eagerly paid crooked doctors to keep me sedated, Valerie. You actively colluded with a filthy parasitic fraud to legally declare me incompetent. You enthusiastically danced on my grave before my heart had even stopped beating all so you could parade around the city pretending you built my empire." Odessa slowly turned her piercing gaze toward Jasmine, who was still clutching Preston's torn tuxedo jacket. "And you, Jasmine," my grandmother continued, her voice dripping with profound disgust, "I gave you every possible advantage in life. I paid for your elite education, I funded your lavish, superficial lifestyle, and you repaid me by standing back and cheerfully applauding while your pathetic husband robbed your grieving sister blind. You knew he intercepted the widow's fund. You knew Sienna was freezing in a slum with a newborn baby. You did not care as long as your diamond tennis bracelets kept arriving." Jasmine burst into dramatic performative tears, dropping to her knees on the wooden stage. "Grandma, please. I did not know the truth. Preston lied to me. He manipulated us both. You have to believe me." Odessa did not offer an ounce of sympathy. She looked down at her golden grandchild with cold, unyielding judgment. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim now, Jasmine. You are a greedy, shallow accomplice. You both sold out your own flesh and blood for country club prestige and leased sports cars. You are a complete disgrace to everything I have painstakingly built." Odessa raised her right hand, signaling one of her lead federal attorneys to step forward. The lawyer handed her a thick, legally binding document bearing a prominent red seal. "I have spent the last 3 days working extensively with my legal team for my secure hospital suite," Odessa announced to the silent, captivated audience of Atlanta's elite. "I have officially restructured the entirety of the family trusts. As of this exact morning, I have legally and permanently disinherited you both. You are completely stripped of the family name, and you are permanently severed from my entire corporate and financial estate. You will never again access a single dime of my wealth. You are officially erased from the history of this proud, powerful family for eternity." The reverberating silence that followed my grandmother's absolute decree was heavy enough to crush solid stone. Jasmine let out a hollow, agonizing wail, collapsing completely onto the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. She buried her tear-stained face in her trembling hands, realizing that her entire identity, her immense wealth, and her precious social standing had just been eradicated by a single legally binding sentence. Valerie looked as though she had been physically struck by a speeding train. She staggered backward, her emerald silk gown rustling harshly as she desperately grabbed the edge of the wooden podium to keep herself from completely falling over. She stared at Odessa, her mouth opening and closing in a pathetic, silent plea for mercy. But my grandmother simply turned her wheelchair slightly, refusing to even look at the daughter who had so callously betrayed her. The wealthy investors and elite politicians in the audience began to murmur rapidly, stepping even further away from the main stage. They were witnessing the spectacular, unprecedented execution of Atlanta's most prominent socialites, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of their catastrophic downfall. Suddenly, a sharp, manic laugh pierced the tense atmosphere of the grand pavilion. Everyone turned their attention back to the center of the brightly lit stage. Preston was slowly pushing himself up from the floor, his bespoke tuxedo completely ruined. His expensive silk tie was torn, and a thin stream of dark blood trickled from a deep scratch on his cheek where Jasmine had violently clawed him. Despite his bruised, pathetic appearance, Preston was chuckling. The low, guttural chuckle quickly escalated into a loud, unhinged, and maniacal laughter that echoed terrifyingly through the high-end audio system. He wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his trembling hand, his blue eyes wide and feverish with desperate, absolute arrogance. He was cornered, stripped of his golden family shield, and publicly exposed as a massive fraud, but he still foolishly believed he held the ultimate trump card. "You really think you have won Odessa?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking with pure manic adrenaline. "You think cutting them off actually hurts me? I do not care about your pathetic family name. I never cared about Valerie's pathetic country club status, and I certainly never cared about this spoiled, useless wife you shackled me to." Jasmine sobbed louder, curling into a tight ball on the floor, but Preston did not even glance down at her. He reached into the inner pocket of his torn tuxedo jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. He held the glowing device high in the air, brandishing it like a deadly weapon for the entire ballroom to clearly see. "You are all too late," Preston declared, his chest heaving as he frantically tapped the glass screen. "You can disinherit them. You can show everyone your little forensic accounting files, Sienna. You can call the police and tell them I am a fraud. But none of it matters. Do you want to know why? Because the money is already gone. I anticipated a legal freeze, so I set up a decentralized offshore routing protocol. I just bypassed the standard banking delays." He swiped his thumb aggressively across the screen, his manic smile stretching from ear to ear. "I just authorized the final massive wire transfer. I completely drained the remaining liquid capital from the secondary trusts, along with every single dollar these idiotic investors handed me tonight. The funds are currently bouncing through a dozen untraceable international nodes. In exactly 2 minutes, that money lands permanently in a secure account in the Cayman Islands. I am walking out of those front doors, I am boarding my private jet, and there is absolutely nothing any of you can do to stop me. I am a multimillionaire and I am completely untouchable." A wave of sheer panic immediately rippled through the crowd of wealthy attendees. The elite investors who had cheerfully handed Preston massive checks just an hour ago suddenly realized their personal fortunes were bundled into his illegal offshore escape. Several men in the front row began shouting frantically, pulling out their own phones to call their bank managers. Valerie screamed at Preston, demanding he reverse the transfer, but her voice was entirely drowned out by the escalating, chaotic uproar of the panicked ballroom. Preston stood at the edge of the stage, watching the high society crowd descend into absolute terror, bathing in the sick, twisted glory of his ultimate financial heist. He genuinely thought he had successfully outsmarted the entire world. He looked directly at me, his bruised face twisted into a victorious, mocking sneer. He fully expected me to scream in frustration. He expected me to desperately lunge at him to try and violently snatch the phone from his hands. Instead, I calmly stepped forward, my crimson power suit catching the bright, blinding glare of the stage spotlight. I walked deliberately toward the center of the stage, my pointed-toe stilettos clicking sharply over the scattered, torn pages of his fake promotional materials. I did not run. I did not panic. I simply reached out and firmly grasped the microphone attached to the wooden podium. The intense, chaotic shouting in the grand pavilion slowly began to die down as the wealthy guests turned their attention toward me. They saw the absolute, unshakable confidence radiating from my posture. I looked down at Preston's glowing smartphone, verifying the confirmation screen displaying the massive, finalized wire transfer. It was the exact, undeniable digital action the federal agents waiting outside desperately needed. He had just publicly executed a multi-million-dollar wire fraud while actively being recorded by dozens of society photographers. He had literally handed the FBI his own sealed coffin. I raised my heavy head, locking my gaze with his wild, desperate blue eyes. A cold, merciless smile slowly spread across my face. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing with absolute authority across the silent room. "You are an arrogant man, Preston. You are so deeply consumed by your own manufactured brilliance that you never once bothered to look at the fine print. I continued, my voice steady and commanding. You assumed that setting up a decentralized offshore routing protocol would make you entirely untraceable. You thought your little financial maze in the Cayman Islands was a foolproof safety net. But you forgot one crucial, undeniable rule of high-stakes finance. Debt is a physical, legally binding chain, and whoever holds the other end of that chain controls your entire life. Preston scoffed loudly, attempting to project confidence, but his voice shook with underlying panic. I do not have any debt anymore, Sienna. I just wired the remaining estate funds. My slate is completely clean. You are just spouting desperate nonsense to save face in front of these people. I am not spouting nonsense, I replied, taking a deliberate step away from the podium and walking closer to the edge of the stage. I am explaining your execution. You see, Preston, you did not wire that money to an offshore haven. You did not secure a peaceful, luxurious future for yourself and your young paralegal. You wired those stolen millions directly into a holding company to cover your massively defaulted loans. You wired it straight to Oasis Holdings. Preston's bruised face contorted in utter confusion. He aggressively tapped his smartphone screen again, desperately trying to comprehend my words. Oasis Holdings is a predatory syndicate, he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. They hold my promissory notes. Paying them off was the absolute first step of my exit strategy. I cleared the ledger. They have no legal claim over me anymore. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through the grand pavilion. You really do not understand, do you? Oasis Holdings is not a shadowy underground betting syndicate, Preston. Oasis Holdings is a proxy limited liability corporation that I legally registered 6 days ago using the emergency $200,000 you failed to steal from me. I approached your ruthless creditors. I showed them the undeniable forensic proof of your impending flight to the Caribbean. I leveraged your cowardly escape plan to negotiate a hostile takeover of your entire financial portfolio. I bought your debt. The color rapidly drained from his arrogant face, leaving him looking exactly like a hollow, terrified ghost. His expensive smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the wooden stage floor with a dull, pathetic final thud. I bought your debt, I repeated, making sure every single wealthy investor in the room heard the absolute truth. I own this building. The massive glass structure you are currently standing in belongs entirely to my corporation. I own the luxury Porsche you drove here tonight. I own the sprawling, heavily leveraged estate you and my sister currently live in. You do not have a clean slate. You are completely bankrupt and you are entirely at my mercy. Valerie let out a strangled, horrified gasp from the side of the stage. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The country club prestige she had sold her soul to protect was officially dead. The wealthy white savior she had worshipped was nothing but a penniless, cornered rat. She slumped against the heavy velvet curtains, her hands covering her face, as the suffocating weight of her social destruction finally crushed her. Jasmine remained curled on the floorboards, weeping hysterically. Her diamond necklace caught the bright stage lights, a mocking reminder of the stolen wealth she was about to lose forever. She looked up at Preston, her tear-streaked face twisted in pure, unadulterated hatred. He had promised her the world, but he had actively engineered her total ruin. "This is impossible," Preston whispered, shaking his head violently as he stumbled backward. "You could not possibly have secured the legal rights to those loans. You did not have the capital. You are a broke, pathetic widow. I am the sole executive director of the company that currently owns your entire life," I corrected him, pulling the thick, legally binding debt assignment contracts from my leather briefcase. I held the heavy stack of documents up for him to see. I risked my son's entire future to secure this financial guillotine. I placed my own trust fund on the line as collateral because I knew you were too arrogant to ever see me coming. I gambled everything on your monumental stupidity, and I won. You have absolutely nothing left, Preston. No money, no fake empire, and no escape. The wealthy socialites and investors who had previously cheered for his success began actively backing away toward the exits. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a bankrupt, exposed fraud. The Grand Pavilion, once a glittering symbol of elite Atlanta society, had transformed into a spectacular public graveyard for Preston's manufactured legacy. He stared at the signed contracts in my hand, his breathing rapid and shallow. The terrifying reality of his total financial ruin finally sank in. He was trapped. There was no secret offshore account. There was no private jet waiting on a quiet tarmac. There was only the cold, harsh consequence of his devastating crimes. He slowly fell to his knees, his tailored tuxedo wrinkling against the stage floor, completely defeated. Just as the absolute finality of my victory settled over the silent, shocked crowd, a sudden piercing sound shattered the atmosphere. The unmistakable wailing shriek of multiple police sirens echoed loudly from the dark city streets outside. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive glass windows of the pavilion. Heavy-booted footsteps pounded rapidly up the red carpet. The grand double doors of the venue were violently kicked open, drowning out the faint jazz music as heavily armed federal agents stormed directly into the room. They immediately flooded the glittering event space, their tactical gear contrasting sharply with the elegant decor. Preston's terrifying, unavoidable reckoning had arrived in full force. The lead FBI agent, a tall man, marched directly up the center steps of the grand stage. He did not hesitate. He grabbed Preston by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the polished wooden podium. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Preston's wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. Preston did not fight back. The arrogant investment banker who mocked my freezing infant son was entirely gone. In his place was a pathetic weeping coward. The federal agent read Preston his Miranda rights with a loud voice, charging him with international wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and elder abuse. The charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would ensure Preston spent his life locked inside a federal penitentiary. The elite socialites and wealthy investors offered no words of protest. Instead, they seamlessly shifted from eager supporters into ruthless spectators. Dozens of smartphone cameras were raised, recording every second of his downfall. Jasmine watched her husband being dragged off the stage, her tear-streaked face twisted in pure horror. She was not crying for the man she loved. She was crying for the lavish, stolen lifestyle being marched out the grand doors. The designer dresses, luxury cars, and country club memberships were gone forever. She slowly turned her head, her wild eyes landing directly on me. The brutal reality of her situation finally pierced through her thick veil of toxic entitlement. I was the sole executive director of Oasis Holdings. I legally owned the massive estate she lived in. I owned the car she drove. I held the absolute authority to evict her and had zero intention of showing mercy. Valerie stumbled away from the heavy velvet curtains, her emerald silk gown dragging heavily across the floor. My mother looked entirely broken. Her meticulously crafted reputation, the superficial high society status she sold my soul to protect, was completely eradicated. She looked at the flashing police lights illuminating the large windows, and then she looked at me standing powerfully in my crimson suit. The power dynamic of our family had irreversibly shifted. Valerie realized the daughter she threw into the cold was now the undisputed matriarch of our empire. Jasmine scrambled across the wooden floorboards, the heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly around her neck. She did not bother to stand up. She threw herself at my feet, her manicured hands grasping at the fabric of my tailored pants. Valerie followed her golden daughter, dropping heavily to her knees right beside her. The two women who colluded to bastardize my child were now weeping at my feet in front of the city. "Sienna, please!" Jasmine wailed, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take my house. Where am I to go? I do not have a job. I do not have any money. Preston lied to me about everything. I am a victim here too. Please, you have to help me." Valerie reached out her trembling hands, attempting to grab my wrist. "Sienna, you have to listen to me." My mother sobbed, her makeup running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. "We made a terrible mistake. We were blinded by his lies. But we are still your family. We are your own flesh and blood. You cannot throw your mother and sister out into the street. Blood is thicker than water. We can fix this. We can be a real family again. You have to find it in your heart to forgive us." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two pathetic, groveling women. I felt absolutely nothing for them. There was no lingering maternal bond, no sisterly affection, and no heartbreaking sense of tragic loss. The woman who would have desperately accepted their hollow apologies died the exact moment they decided to let my baby freeze. I looked around the silent ballroom. The politicians and socialites were watching my every move, silently waiting to see if the grieving widow would crumble under the heavy weight of familial guilt. I gently but firmly pulled my leg out of Jasmine's desperate grip. I took a deliberate step back, physically distancing myself from their toxic presence. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, desperate eyes. "Do not you dare speak to me about blood being thicker than water," I said, my voice echoing with lethal, unshakable authority. "When I came to you begging for help to pay Julian's medical bills, you told me I was an embarrassment. When I was trapped in a freezing apartment trying to keep your grandson alive, you offered me a pathetic bribe and threatened to call Child Protective Services. You explicitly declared my child a bastard tonight just to protect your fake social standing. You chose a wealthy, arrogant thief over your own daughter." I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my crimson suit jacket. I pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. It was the exact same $100 bill that Preston had viciously thrown at me earlier this evening. I let it flutter from my fingers, watching it slowly drift down until it landed perfectly on the wooden stage floor, right between Valerie and Jasmine. "I am the executive director of a multi-million-dollar corporation now," I announced, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the grand pavilion. "I only deal with million-dollar projects, but I have $100 for your taxi." Jasmine let out another agonizing, defeated sob, while Valerie buried her face in her trembling hands. I did not stay to watch them cry. I turned my back on the shattered, pathetic remnants of my former family. I walked confidently down the center steps of the stage, the crowd of onlookers immediately parting to give me a wide, respectful berth. I walked out the heavy, gold-leafed double doors into the crisp Atlanta night. I took a deep, steadying breath, completely ready to start my beautiful, unburdened new life, leaving their toxic shadows behind me forever. The cold winter wind felt incredibly refreshing against my skin as I walked down the grand steps of the pavilion. I did not look back at the flashing police lights or the shattered remnants of my family's fake empire. That night marked the definitive end of my life as a scapegoat. The agonizing chapter of grief and subjugation was officially closed, replaced by a ruthless, unyielding clarity. I hailed a quiet taxi and drove back to my grandmother's safe hospital suite, completely ready to begin the massive reconstruction of our stolen family legacy. Exactly 1 year has passed since that explosive night, and the landscape of our lives has fundamentally changed. The federal justice system, which Preston arrogantly believed he could manipulate, showed him absolutely no mercy. The FBI investigation was swift and devastating. Armed with the undeniable financial records I provided and the highly public confession he practically screamed into a microphone, the prosecution completely dismantled his expensive legal defense. To save herself from federal conspiracy charges, his secret 24-year-old paralegal immediately turned state's evidence, testifying against him in open court. Preston was officially convicted of international wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and severe elder abuse. The federal judge handed down a harsh mandatory 15-year sentence in a bleak maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant investment banker who once wore bespoke tuxedos and leased luxury sports cars now wears a standard, highly regulated orange jumpsuit. He spends his days locked inside a sterile concrete cell, completely stripped of his fake name, his stolen wealth, and his ridiculous unearned pride. He is just another forgotten inmate serving hard time, completely erased from the elite financial world he so desperately tried to conquer. He eats terrible cafeteria food, sleeps on a thin mattress, and performs manual labor for pennies, constantly remembering the glorious stolen empire he foolishly threw away forever. The fallout for my mother and sister was equally catastrophic, delivering a brand of poetic justice that no judge could ever legally mandate. Without Preston's stolen money or my grandmother's corporate trusts to artificially inflate their lifestyle, Valerie and Jasmine faced immediate crushing bankruptcy. I legally foreclosed on the sprawling Buckhead estate, forcing them to pack their remaining belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. Because they had actively participated in Preston's fraud, every single high society friend they once bragged about instantly blacklisted them. The exclusive country club revoked their memberships, and the elite charity boards publicly expelled them. Left with absolutely nothing, they were brutally forced to rent a tiny, drafty, rat-infested unit in the exact same rundown, freezing apartment complex they had so viciously mocked me for living in just 12 months prior. Today, Valerie works a grueling, minimum-wage shift as a greeter at a local discount department store, forced to swallow her toxic pride every time a former socialite friend walks past her without saying hello. Jasmine works the evening shift at a noisy fast food drive-thru, smelling constantly of old grease instead of expensive French perfume. They are trapped in the exact miserable, suffocating poverty they cheerfully tried to condemn my innocent son to. They regularly attempt to call my corporate office, leaving pathetic, weeping voicemails begging for a second chance. I never listened to them. I permanently deleted their numbers from my phone and my life. They are completely, utterly irrelevant to me now. Meanwhile, I stepped confidently into the massive power vacuum they left behind. I did not just return to my freelance recipe development business. With Odessa's absolute blessing and mentorship, I officially took over as the chief executive officer of our family's multi-million-dollar hair care empire. I aggressively restructured the corporate board, firing every single corrupt executive who had previously turned a blind eye to Preston's blatant embezzlement. I infused the company with fresh, innovative strategies, expanding our massive global product distribution network. Simultaneously, I scaled my culinary business, launching an international line of premium organic baby foods inspired by my desperate struggle to feed Leo safely. But my proudest, most fulfilling achievement is the Julian Foundation. Using the exact $200,000 of recovered trust money that started this entire war, I established a massive philanthropic organization dedicated to providing immediate, unconditional financial grants to widowed single mothers facing sudden economic crises. We provide safe housing, legal protection, and critical childcare subsidies, guaranteeing that no grieving woman in Atlanta ever has to choose between freezing in a dark apartment and feeding her newborn baby. My grandmother Odessa made a miraculous, complete recovery. The heavy stress of the betrayal initially weakened her heart, but watching me ruthlessly dismantle her enemies breathed a fierce, entirely new life into her spirit. She now sits beside me at the head of the corporate boardroom, offering invaluable, razor-sharp advice as we continue to build our empire. The profound disappointment she once looked at me with has completely vanished. In its place is a deep, unshakable respect. She frequently tells our corporate partners that I am the only person strong enough to carry the family legacy into the next generation. Most importantly, I finally built the beautiful, warm, and secure life my late husband Julian always wanted for us. I purchased a stunning, sprawling home in a quiet, deeply wooded neighborhood far away from the toxic, superficial glare of high society. My son Leo is now a healthy, thriving, and incredibly happy toddler. He happily runs across the warm, sunlit hardwood floors, continuously filling our safe, peaceful home with bright, joyful laughter. He will never know the bitter cold of that apartment or the vicious cruelty of his aunt. I look back on that freezing Tuesday morning, not with lingering anger, but with profound, quiet gratitude. The brutal fire my family ignited did not burn me to ashes. It forged me into an absolute weapon. The precious stolen legacy has been completely reclaimed. Our future is permanently secured, and absolute justice has finally been served. I am no longer the victim they created. I am the architect of my own destiny now.